welcome you as we continue in the celebration of Le Corbusier's centenary year. Institutions all over the world, art galleries, schools, foundations who are founded in Le Corbusier's memory are all joining together all of this year in celebrating his memory with lectures, symposiums, exhibitions of his paintings and his architectural drawings. And so we at SCI-Arc are also extending our hands to the other institutions and in this series of lectures that began last week with William Curtis last Monday night, and we'll continue with Geoffrey Baker from England, and he will be speaking Monday, Wednesday, Friday afternoon and Wednesday evening, and tonight Mohan Sharma from Chandigarh. He was the chief architect from Chandigarh for 29 years, and he will be joining us for an 8 o'clock lecture. In this series, we're taking the opportunity to focus on Le Corbusier's highly original thinking, rational problem-solving solutions, and personal reinterpretation of history. We continue in this exploration with Dr. Geoffrey Baker, who completed his master's at the University of Manchester and his PhD at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne. Beginning his scholarly involvement with Le Corbusier in 1971, his thesis was entitled Le Corbusier and the Articulation of Architectural Elements. He spent some 6 years working in the profession before he began to teach at Newcastle, then at Brighton Polytechnic, where he continues to teach design, history, and theory, design criticism, and is director of dissertation studies and postgraduate research. He has lectured widely in the U.S. and Great Britain, and has held the position of Director of Architecture at the University of Arkansas, where he is now a visiting professor on a regular basis. He was co-author for a television series on the history of architecture and scripted and narrated a film on Le Corbusier in 1972. A few years ago, he published Le Corbusier, An Analysis of Form. This book, which I think many of you are already familiar with, An Analysis Through Drawing, which is a very fine book. And he is coming out with a new book on Corbusier, a monograph that will soon be in our bookstores. In this first lecture of his week in residence here at SCI-Arc, Dr. Baker will focus on the white cubic architecture of the 20s. I'm very pleased to introduce to you Dr. Geoffrey Baker.
Thank you very much. It goes without saying that it's a tremendous pleasure always to visit SCI-Arc. It's my third visit in 3 years, and I do enjoy coming here, particularly, I think, to have the opportunity this week of extending my discussion of Corbu into a series of talks. It's very difficult to deal with Corbu in one talk. One deals with aspects, and indeed, I shall be just looking at aspects in the whole series of talks. I mean, my own position is one which is something that's interested me, but that's the beauty of Corbu, that we can all find an enormous amount to study. I tend to focus in very strongly on the techniques that Corbu developed. And this idea of analyzing buildings in order to show the way that his designs are organized will be, I suppose, the kind of core to the discussion. What I want to do really is to start off today by setting up the foundation for what will follow, by looking very briefly, a kind of overview to put into perspective some of the earlier years of his work, the earlier events which fashioned his thinking, leading on then to Purism and to some of the early buildings of the 20s. I think this will be a nice way to take us on to the next talk, which will look at the more significant houses of the 1920s? Well, if we begin by mentioning, of course, that he was born in October, the 6th of October in 1887, and that is where he was actually born, in this apartment block in La Chaux-de-Fonds. And he spent his early education, of course, at the art school. We're looking at a couple of sketches that he did at that time. And he came under the influence, as I'm sure you know, of his teacher, Le Platonnier, who encouraged him to go out sketching and to draw from nature ideas that he could reinterpret in his buildings. And he was very much at that time influenced by Ruskin and Owen Jones. Eugene Grasset, his book about ornament, was also a source. But the Ruskinian passion for studying nature and viewing nature as almost a moral kind of force one that we could actually draw upon and use. The decorative ornament that was being designed always relied very largely on nature as its source. And what we're looking at here are some drawings done of junctions, structural junctions in a building that were fashioned from drawings that he'd done at the River Doubs in nearby La Chaux-de-Fonds. I don't want to spend too long on this because this is a whole subject in itself, but I do want to give you this brief background about the importance of nature to him at this time. This is a sketch of flowers, and on the far side we have the watch case design that he was doing, where he won a prize for the design of a watch case that's built, as you can see, on natural forms, on foliage and so on. The early houses, and I think we could do with actually just moving one of the projectors slightly to one side in order that we can get the double picture in. The one on that side needs to be moved a little over, I think. That's better, thank you. In the first houses, he designed the Villa Fallet at La Chaux-de-Fonds that we see on the far side, and then that was in about 1904, when he was only 17, 18 years old. And on the near side we see the Villa Jacquemet that was designed in 1907, 1908. Now, in these early houses, the influence of nature was very strong. He was using in the Villa Fallet the pine tree as the motive for the design. And we find him operating in the local vernacular style with suggestions perhaps of Art Nouveau. But on the far side we see a cabinet that he designed in the Villa Stotzer that was designed in 1908. So this is just to give a general idea of his interests at this time when he was a young man and trying to discover as much as he could about the nature of architecture. This is a sketch that he did in La Chaux-de-Fonds. And he went on a study tour in 1907 at the instigation of his teacher, where he studied a whole number of buildings and frescoes in Florence. He visited Italy very much because Ruskin had written this book, Mornings in Florence, and he carried the book with him. And he went to the places that Ruskin suggested you should go to, and he took a tremendous amount of notes of the buildings that he was looking at by simply making an inventory of the various features on the facades. That's the Bargello on the far side, and it's a very typical sketch of this early period, where he's simply annotating details that he perceives on the facade, and we see the same here at Or San Michele. This notion of drawing as much as he could from the buildings he saw was central to his education, and in 1910 he produced this design for an atelier d'art, a school of art in La Chaux-de-Fonds, where he'd been a student and where he later went on to teach. And this study brings in another aspect of his thinking at this time, and that was the importance of geometry and the importance of primary forms, so that we have the whole design based on the notion of a central pyramid, which was the Great Hall, and the various study rooms for the disciplines are scattered around this in a pyramidal kind of build-up of the whole form, with the identification of the particular units in which the different classes were taught. And then in 1911 he went on another very important study tour, the Voyage to the Orient, the Journey to the East, where he really developed some of the main elements in his philosophy. He studied the mosques, he studied the Acropolis, and he studied peasant architecture. And he was really getting to grips at this time with the relationship between the heart and the mind, in the sense that he was growing to believe that forms could affect our hearts if they were fashioned in a certain way. And he found that the primary forms of the mosques, the straightforward construction that was used to build them, and the fact that one went through a series of spaces, transitional spaces, before getting into the main space, and the relationship of spaces to each other, the relationship of lighting to the character and the mood of the space, he was beginning to fully understand all this. And this is a sketch he did of his favorite building, the Sulemani Mosque. So just, as I say, going fairly rapidly through some of these early influences on him. The influence of the silhouette, the primary form, looking at again, these are sketches of the Sulemani, and the understanding that he was developing through visiting the Acropolis of the way that an intellectual organization of the parts of a building, as in, say, the Parthenon, could affect our minds. So it's a combination of two issues that were concerning him. As I say, the immediate emotional effect of what we perceive when we see forms in light, and then the way our minds can be affected by the kind of intellectual control that may be applied to a building through the geometrical organization and so on. He became intoxicated on this tour with peasant art, and he describes it as a striking creation of aesthetic sensuality. And he grew to adore the kind of simplicity and the integrity that he found in the peasant buildings of the Eastern Mediterranean. He came to believe that there was a kind of lifestyle that was very pure, and if you worked, say, in the fields all day and you came home at night and you lived in simple peasant houses, that was a harmonious existence, and that was something that he respected. And he found that certain cities, and he mentions Bucharest as one of these, as having a kind of cancer whereby there was pollution from perhaps overcrowding or slums or poverty or whatever, and he regarded this kind of thing as a kind of cancer. So he was looking for, in an idealistic way, for a perfect kind of existence and a perfect kind of architecture that would result from that. These are sketches that he did on the tour, and it's a very comprehensive kind of study that he was doing. It ranged from the general to the particular. And we find on the far side a typical sketch where he's looking at the inside and outside of a gateway, how the path leads through the gateway, and he makes his comments. And here how housing is stepping down on a hillside. And after that tour, he came back to La Chaux-de-Fonds, and in 1912 he built the house for his parents that we see on the far side, and he built the Villa Fabre-Jacob in nearby Le Locle, and that's what we see on the near side. And he was trying on this occasion to interpret the classical principles of design that he'd seen in a fairly literal way, as we see on the near side, with a classical pediment and so on, and a very Italianate composition. And then on the far side we see him abstracting this into the notion of a kind of frieze underneath an overhanging roof. a building probably largely, to some degree anyway, influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright's Winslow House. If we study the two houses, we can see links there. And then in 1916, he designed the Villa Schwab that we see on the far side, again bringing together many of the ideas that he developed on that earlier tour of 1911 to the east. It's known in La Chaux-de-Fonds as the Villa Turque, and we see a kind of apsidal projections on the side of the house on the long axis that are not dissimilar to the arrangement of, say, Hagia Sophia, where that is based on one long axis and a central cubic space with the apses sticking out on the axis. And then he also designed in 1916 the Cinema La Scala in La Chaux-de-Fonds. Now, if we look at the kind of position he'd reached in 1916, it's possible to see that even then he'd come to conclusions which formed the basis of his later work. And in the Villa Schwab, these are demonstrated. The notion that we have mass, these are quotes from Vers une architecture, and a lot of the notes that were written that later formed Vers une architecture were done on the journey to the east, and he was well aware of these facts much earlier than the publication of the book in 1923. And the idea that architecture is the masterly, correct and magnificent play of masses brought together in light is present in that villa, the Villa Schwab. The task of the architect to vitalize the surfaces that clothe the masses, that's all there as well. Mass and surface are determined by the plan, certainly. And from the use of inert materials and starting from conditions more or less utilitarian, you've established certain relationships which have aroused my emotions. This is architecture. So he was very concerned, certainly at this time, to arouse our emotions with the arrangement of forms. And this building does bring together many of these ideas, the idea of bold massing, the idea of clear axial geometry, site relationship, this clever relationship to the walls surrounding the site with the facade locked onto it, and then the impact of the main facade, which is actually here, and surface modulation in the way that the brickwork around the concrete shell is handled. And I don't know whether that we can quite see in this corner, but never mind. We've got a proportional system used, which he was already using on this building. We've also got, maybe if you can lift it up a little, we've also got the historic, that's better, thank you, because I shall be using a lot of diagrams, so it's useful to have it visible. Historic reference back possibly to Hagia Sophia in what I was describing about the apses sticking out from the side of this cubic building. And then we have complex, quite sophisticated spatial articulation. Well, in 1916 too, he'd been working with a friend on the Domino system of reinforced concrete, and we have the famous diagram illustrated in the Œuvre Complète. And this, of course, was the way that he was able to free himself notionally from the idea of load-bearing walls, so that he had the freedom to plan and compose, as we shall see later. But at the early stages, the Domino Principles was expressed in designs such as this, which are just using industrial windows and arranging the buildings in the form of a domino pattern, but not really taking full advantage or exploiting the possibilities that are available using the slab and columns. And it was when he designed a couple of abattoirs in 1917, just competition entries these were, they were not built, that he really was able to establish his first machine aesthetic. And he was able, because these were factories, to get away from domestic imagery and to use the function of the abattoir, that is to send in cattle at one end of the building, up ramps, they were slaughtered, they were taken along on pulleys, and they emerged at the end of this process in cans and were taken away on the railway. So he was able to introduce a purely functional arrangement now without having to bother with domestic imagery, and he was able to introduce industrial windows as well, and the reinforced concrete construction that we've just seen with the slab and columns. So we have for the first time the appearance of the ramp in his work, and we have the new language of the machine appearing. But what we don't have is any really inventive planning or inventive three-dimensional organization. If we look at the house for his parents, for example, that was designed in 1912, it has an interesting open space, and so does the Villa Schwab, but they're both based on one very simple axial notion, which is what we see on all these earlier houses. Those two houses that we've just looked at, the Villa Schwab and the house for his parents that we see here, are simply based on cross axes with an apse on both sides in this on one side here with a projecting bay on the other. So it's asymmetrical organization on all the early houses. The Villa Fallet, south-facing facade, the Villa Stotzer and Jacquemet, 1908, south-facing facades with projecting wings, and the Favre Jaco Villa, the Italianate one, not very different really. A main axis, a turning circle for a motor car, and a screen to enclose us as we move towards the building. Well, if we compare that with Frank Lloyd Wright, the kind of things that he was doing in the Arthur Hertley house as early as 1902, or the Ward Willits house, we find that he's using a pinwheel plan, we find he's using a cruciform plan, he's really beginning to do interesting and exciting things with space and geometrical organization. Jeanneret wasn't. He was simply doing this sort of thing. And of course, I should have mentioned at the beginning that he was Charles Edward Jeanneret until he changed his name in 1920 and adopted the pseudonym Le Corbusier. We'll come to that later. Now, a very important event, of course, was the appearance in 1908, I think it was, of Les Demoiselles d'Avignon by Picasso. Now, in 1908, at that time, Jeanneret had been working in the office of Auguste Perret. And it was when he was working with Perret that he first realized how important reinforced concrete could be as a building material. And Perret had already more or less conclusively shown, even in the block that the young Jeanneret was working in, the apartment block in Paris, that you could have a roof terrace, you could have a free facade, you could have a free plan, and all that was evident to him in 1908. And also in 1908 we have this transformation of painting by Picasso. Well, if we move on past 1916, which was where we were with the Villa Schwab, there was an unfortunate lawsuit which left the young Jeanneret very much, his reputation was tarnished because he spent more money than the client had really permitted him to do on the building, and this was embarrassing to his reputation in La Chaux-de-Fonds, and he left La Chaux-de-Fonds in February 1917, and he moved permanently to Paris. Now, in Paris, he went in the following May to one of the coffee mornings organized in Perret's office that he was still visiting, still friendly with Auguste Perret, and he met Amédée aux Enfants. And this was a very significant meeting because aux Enfants was a painter, established as a painter. He produced a series of articles and comments under the title L'élan, and he was arguing both in favor of the machine. He designed some coachwork for machines, and he was arguing against the decorative tendencies of Cubism. So the two men were very necessary to each other, really, because Jeanneret was looking towards art and towards some way of establishing an artistic way of dealing with the new force in life, the machine. And Cubism, according to aux Enfants, was not the answer. Cubism was, in aux Enfants' belief, a kind of decorative statement, a rather confusing statement that lacked any real intellectual substance. So the two men got together, and they together formed this new movement known as Purism. And the new movement reached publication in 1918 in a book that was entitled Après le Cubisme, or Beyond Cubism. And so the two men addressed what was to them one of the most important aspects of the 20th century. namely the way that science and the emerging machine technology would affect life as it was becoming. And they believed that a new kind of art was needed that would take account of science and the machine, and something that Cubism had not done, and they therefore worked out a comprehensive theory. And this theory was back to the two things I've already mentioned. It was back to the way the senses and the mind work in terms of the phenomena which we encounter in daily life. And one central idea in this was that art could enable man to establish contact with the universal force that governs existence. Because Jeanneret had come to believe that there is a universal force with which we can have contact. And he talks about this many times, about the relationship between man, nature, and the cosmos. And this universal force is something that really became very much part of the Purist philosophy, because they thought that it was possible to look at man-made artifacts, and that man-made artifacts could respond in the same way to the laws of economy that govern elements in nature. It was a kind of Darwinian view which believed as a universal principle that there was a law of economy through fitness of purpose. In other words, if anything evolves in nature, it evolves perfectly because it is evolving in accordance with a particular requirement. Our hands evolve because we have to do things with them, and over time they've evolved perfectly to do what they have to do. They believed that the results of this kind of principle were always towards harmony, order, and balance in all things. That was a central view of the Purist philosophy. And as I say, what they were trying to do was to show how even the machine was responding to the same laws of economy and fitness and purpose that are present in nature. They put forward the idea that art could enable man to establish contact with this universal force. You could, through the medium of the painting, you could get in contact with this grand design that governs everything. And in 1920 they launched the magazine L'Esprit Nouveau, the New Spirit, which had two purposes. One of them was to act as a forum for discussion of the ideas on which Purism was based, and the other was as a publicity vehicle to get the two men known, and it brought them to the attention of the avant-garde, and in fact gained Jeanneret some of his first commissions. Now, they explained Purism as being concerned with the universal properties of the senses and the mind. And the articles in L'Esprit Nouveau extended this discussion beyond the arts to include the sciences, biology, psychology, and sociology. And there were two issues dominating the discussion. One was to establish universal principles by means of logic, and in the process relating man to nature. The other was to study and, if possible, clarify the relationship between sensation and aesthetics. And this latter concern came to the view that if an aesthetic language were to communicate universally, it could only do so through the use of primary forms and colours. Now, Jeanneret had come to believe this very much on the visit to the Acropolis and the journey to the East in 1911. And he thought that this kind of primary form juxtaposition, whether it be the sort of hemisphere we see on this saucer dome of Hagia Sophia, or whether it be the arrangement of the block on the Capitol that effects the transition from the cylindrical column to the rectilinear beam, it was always a primary form that could directly affect our senses. And of course, in Varian architecture, he goes to great lengths to continue to express that position. Primary forms and colours were universally understood. Therefore, they would communicate. What he didn't appreciate was that the meanings inherent in, say, the Parthenon, or that's the Propylaea, in fact, or Hagia Sophia, were understood as much as anything through the medium of being familiar. It was the same idea used time and time again. To take this notion as he did and abstract it, this is what Jeanneret did as Le Corbusier, and use primary forms in entirely new aesthetic combinations was a different matter. And his abstract compositions and his buildings and semi-abstract works of art have, to be honest, only been appreciated by the avant-garde. They have not been appreciated by the mass of the population in the way that he intended. However, they reached their own conclusions, they acquired their own following, and as part of their philosophy they insisted that objects depicted in paintings should have a significance beyond the utilitarian function that they had. They should have meanings that symbolize key principles. So what they did for their paintings, they selected the objects that they believed had evolved in an evolutionary way, objects such as pipes, books, bottles, carafes, that sort of thing, that were to them perfect objects, just as the hand is a perfect object. And the significance of these objects was very important to them. There were lessons in the objects themselves. So this principle of evolving what they call the objet type, which could be, as I say, any of the perfect objects that they were using in their paintings, was an attempt to take a natural law and apply it to artifacts. And nature, you see, was at the basis of all this. It was very much a Darwinian evolutionary view of nature, and nature was the main inspiration and source. But it was trying to take account of the impact of technology on the environment. Now, on the surface, nature appears to have infinite variety. But this variety, they argued, was based on certain laws that do not vary and which produce constant, unchanging organisms. And the mechanisms which result in the variety, they said, were universal and constant. And the variety occurs only through the way the needs are met in different situations. So the Purists believed that all the objects that we see, both in nature and whether they're machine-based, rely on a certain kind of basic, almost universal kind of organization. And they believed that this organization was geometrical in essence. They believe that organisms in nature are clear in their forms, and that these forms too are based on geometrical structures. So they felt geometry had to be the underlying discipline for works of art, because through that means order and clarity could be preserved. And order and clarity are central themes in the Purist philosophy. Harmony, order, clarity, communicative effectiveness. Ozenfort and Jeanneret believed that art was lagging behind science and technology in failing to come to terms with the principles which govern nature. They felt that scientific knowledge, as demonstrated in the machine and so on, was able to show the principles that they discerned in nature, and they felt that the machine was demonstrating the same kind of principles. But they thought that Cubist art was floundering in a kind of chaotic representation of ambiguities and shifting relationships that really failed to convey what was to them the essence of life. Now, if order is to be represented through art, communication is desperately important. The objet type became necessary in the paintings, and when Jeanneret began to paint in 1918, he concentrated on arranging these significant objects in ways that could communicate. So that's one of the earliest paintings that he did, and that was that's called Nature Morte, Libre Vert et Pipe, and this is Le Bol Rouge that he painted again in 1918. And in both of them we see these simple objects, the significance of the book, the pipe, the glass, the little container and the scroll, and a piece of vellum and a cube. These are arranged in ways that were just beginning to have some sort of compositional appeal. But we've seen from the earlier buildings that he was extremely limited in his compositional ability until he started to do this. All those asymmetrical, bilaterally symmetrical buildings were not inventive in any real sense. But in a very short time, he extended the range of his objet type, and he started to produce paintings that have considerable complexity. And he starts to contrast the various shapes in the paintings. He starts to contrast the various elements, and he uses at certain times guitars or whatever. And here he's getting towards a kind of abstraction. These are done post-1920, where he's able to organize the picture surface now in a very inventive and quite elaborate way, using color, shapes, suggestions at times of transparency and opacity, and contrasts of solid and void and overlaps and so on. So he's really taking the whole notion of composition far ahead of what he was able to do until he was able to compose in accordance with these principles. Now, if we move on to the way that this was applied architecturally, and we move on to 1920, when he adopted this pseudonym Le Corbusier, he used that pseudonym to express the difference between his architecture, which was under the name of Le Corbusier, and his paintings that still were under the name of Aux Enfants, of Jeanneret. Now, he designed a number of buildings in which he was attempting to use these principles of order, of clarity of form, and in which the various parts of the building achieve the same significance as the objet type. And he worked out a design for an ideal dwelling, the Maison Citroën, which he took on from 1920 right through to 1927 in a series of developments. And basically, as we see it on the far side, what we've got is a double cube with one axis. And that is developed by him in a manner that exploits the fact that you've got a series of planes, vertical planes and horizontal planes, which enable a subdivision of space so that we can have a double height volume here and a sleeping volume above, an eating and cooking area down below with a solarium on top. So the basic subdivision within that double cube is one which produces some interesting spatial effects. We've actually got a living area on the ground floor, we've got a kitchen and bedroom at the back, and underneath the overhanging boudoir we've got the dining area here, and then the staircase, as you can see, is coming up on the outside of the building here. And he's got a cylindrical spiral stair on the inside. So what he's doing is sculpting the mass to exploit some important contrasts of the form, using this oblique of the staircase and the cylinder inside very much in the way that he was composing his paintings, and using these as objet type. This was a functional element of the same kind of significance as a book or a pipe, and so was the spiral staircase. The composition obeys the laws of the axis determining the organization. It has a certain frontality. He works out the fact that we, on the front facade, should have a large window to give maximum light into the villa. So we've got a maximum of space and light. We've got a roof terrace, and we've got a series of zones in which we have part cellular zones, part transitional zones that are platforms looking onto the open area below. And we have this general concept organized in that way. Well, what he's actually doing in this kind of thing that we see here, he's now departed from the bilaterally symmetrical solidity of the Villa Schwab, say, of 1916, to something which is now a series of overlapping planes, and which has the potential for the kind of complexity in its organization that was present in his paintings. And this is the most celebrated of the early paintings, Still Life with a Pile of Plates, that was done in 1920, and he got to this stage in 2 years from the early paintings. And if we look at the organization of this, we can see that it's got a central axis with the significant book right on the axis, and we've got a tabletop here, again on mid-axis. You can divide the composition with regulating lines. That's how it's organized. And then he's got two guitars, one of them here and another one at the back,
but that one is portrayed as if it's a shadow of this one. He's got a pile of plates here, and opposite that, at the other side of the book, he's got countering it a cylindrical receptacle, some kind of bottle. So we've got a major focus here, and we've got a secondary focus here, balancing each other off. And then on the right, we've got another bottle, and these are shown partly, as it were, in plan, and partly almost three-dimensionally. He's got two pipes locking themselves around another cylinder in the middle, and he uses a whole series of colours to reinforce this idea. But what the main point is that we now have a statement which is really one of dynamic equilibrium. We have the harmony, we have the balance, we have the order, we have the significant objects, and we have them controlled by regulating lines and an organizational geometry. And the composition now has a degree of lyricism, a degree of sophistication that was able to be translated into the houses. The whole idea was also expressed at about the same time, 1922, in the proposal for the Viel Contemporaine, where the underlying notion was again one of geometry, so that we have a central axis, and this time it is the symmetrical geometry, and we have the main business district in the center with its cruciform towers, and then we have something very much like the domino system of apartments, with these oblique arteries separating out the function of driving from walking, and we have all this set in parkland with the kind of mystical shimmering glass towers symbolic of the new age. So we still have nature, we still have controlling geometry, we still have an idealized representation of certain functions. And we have a hierarchical arrangement with a kit of parts in which we have this system of priorities, a classification of the various elements that form the city. The same designation of zones within the city that we had designated in the house itself. A very clear representation. This idea of communication, clarity, was present in both. And what he did, as he did throughout his life with all his work, was to refine this idea. He progressively refined all his ideas throughout his life. So that now we have, again, the frame is used here, the domino frame that he didn't use in the earlier house because the earlier citron was intended to be built anywhere so that it could have masonry side walls and just a flat concrete slab for the floors. Now this time he's using the structural frame. He's really able to do more with that, such as raise the building up off the ground. And these 5 points, the philosophy of the new architecture, you know, to free the landscape by elevating the building, the free plan, the free facade, the ribbon window, and the roof terrace, all these ideas were evolving as part of the new language. Well, what he does now, he puts the staircase, as we can see, inside the house, where it would work better, probably. He's put the spiral stair alongside it in a different relationship, so that we actually move around it to get into the space. And there's just a little bit of reorganization of the plan, not very much. You've got a terrace now elevated, and you've got a garage below. We've still got the same window that's facing out on this southern side. We've got the roof terrace as before. We've got, as I say, a side entrance, and we've got this entrance through here now that takes you up onto that staircase. So if we look at it in terms of the actual arrangement, we've got down below a garage, cellar, heating, then we come up this way onto the terrace, we move around the spiral staircase into the dining area, which is very similar to what he had before. Kitchen and bedroom tucked underneath, the living room now going up through the 2 spaces, but the actual staircase on the inside with the boudoir on the way as you're going up to a bathroom at the higher level, a bathroom, associated with the boudoir and the bedroom, and the staircase takes you up to another pair of bedrooms with a toilet at the top. And then we've got the solarium, the roof terrace. It's a cascade theme. The windows are arranged in accordance with the structure between the columns. It's very orderly, very precise, and nicely worked out. Oops, sorry. Now, in 1927, the idea was taken a stage further, where the notion of the orthogonal cage that dominates his work, certainly from or about 1923 onwards, we find him using the orthogonal cage, in which he contrasts and tensions curves against the cage and so on. That begins to take over in his work. And what we find as the idea becomes more sophisticated is that we've got the building elevated now, we've got it nicely enclosed within still a kind of double cubic arrangement on which the floor planes are expressed. We've got the staircase still inside, and it's associated again with this overhanging balcony, but now we've got that at an angle. We've got the chimney flue coming through, and we've got quite an interesting sculptural effect where these elements come together inside the building. If we just look at how that is expressed, basically what we've got are the planes as before, the vertical planes in between which is sandwiched the main area, and then we've got the staircase which is ascending in that way alongside. And we get the expression of the staircase now coming through as a small balcony, and we find that the staircase, the flue, and the balcony itself, with a little writing desk formed there in the balcony, plus the chimney itself, become one of these typical ensembles, very much like the way the two pipes in the painting were actually interlocked around the central vessel. So we find the interlock here, which is a central idea in Corbusier's work throughout his career, becomes evident. And there's that little writing desk on the platform, and there we can see hanging down from it a space divider, which is in fact this element here that we can see, which is a divider between the forward main space and the rest. The movement progression that was beginning to be felt in the earlier house, the earlier versions, is again evident here in the care that he takes to take you in and then take you along and through, so that we're passing through screens as we move into the dining area and the living area. We move again up the stairs and we pass into the boudoir, and again past the bath as we move into the bedroom. The idea of going past an object to get into another space is very much part of this early philosophy. Now, the villa at Vaucresson, those were ideal projects. The first of the Citroën houses were not built, although the last one was built at the Weissenhof exhibition in 1927. But he did design in 1922 the villa at Vaucresson. And this villa was for a client, it was Monsieur and Madame Besnus, who were regular readers of L'Esprit Nouveau. So they commissioned the young architect to do this house and gave him one of his first opportunities to build in the new language. The site was in a little suburb of Paris, where we've got a fall on the site. As you can see, it's actually a sloping site, and there's a main axis in this direction. So what he had to do was to carve into the slope to produce a 3-story volume, with the front on 3 stories and the back at the higher level on 2 stories. In an earlier design, he pushed out the staircase, as we see here. He had to have a staircase at one side. That was an early decision he took in the design process. He stuck it out, and he says that this was an error, and it was due to being, as he said, in an aesthetic trance. But what he did to remedy that was to stick the staircase out at the side so that it's along the main axis, so that we separate out this staircase volume, expressing it very clearly, and then we use the space in between the 2 volumes to give access to the house. That's the entry point. And there we have these 2 axes represented. Now, the actual handling of this volume is based on the notion of a central core that he establishes here. This square is the central core, and then the frame extends the design to become a rectangle. The core idea is developed at the first floor by entering, we go on at ground floor actually and ascend the staircase, and then we ascend at the, you'd call this the second floor, wouldn't you? You call that the first floor and this the second floor. And then we go past the core, which is the library. We go round into the living, and we have the dining there and the kitchen. And the core idea is expressed through the services as well. And there we see the core, which has come through at the top level as we go up the staircase again, as a central unit containing the bath. And around that we have a series of bookshelves leading in to the bedroom, and we go right round that into the boudoir. So that's the notion in 3 dimensions of the centroidal core, and he treats the elevations in terms of the fact that this one, being on 3 stories, has a vertical accentuation, and he has the central axis defined with a vertical element projecting out that we see here. It's projected out as a small window, and there we see it. And then we have the main division between the 2 blocks expressed vertically very powerfully as well. So that vertical element is very strongly identified. And of course that is a kind of asymmetrical composition where we're balancing out the difference between the symmetrical bit and the bit that's been stuck on. But on the reverse side, where we're looking at the back of the building on 2 levels, we've got symmetry. We've just got the central window at the back of the living area, and we have the whole thing quite symmetrically organized with this main window across there. So he's observing correct rules of composition in the organization of the design. And there we see this central core element that we come along and move past on the way through the living area. Now, I think if I'm to talk for 1 hour today, and I think that's probably long enough in terms of the other studio commitments, I could end just on this note, where we look at one of his notional schemes, an idealized dwelling for workers, where he uses these geometrical ideas of the cube in this case, subdivided by a platform to which we gain access by a staircase, creating 2 kinds of space. We have the window organized in accordance with the general volumetric arrangement. We have entry on the corner, on the oblique. We have a living area, a dining area, which is underneath the overhang, and we have a kitchen underneath as well. And there we have this sculptural statement. There isn't, in fact, any bathroom in this design. There's a kitchen, but there's curiously no bathroom. But these are intended for mass production, and they really do epitomize the main point that I've been trying to make today, which is a preoccupation with a certain kind of universal architectural language communicated through primary forms, a geometrical language, the sculpting of space, a consistent development through the geometry of the arrangement of elements, including fenestration, that results in a kind of aesthetic richness which was intended to enrich our lives. So I think there I will stop today, having established some of the ground rules for the architecture which we shall see developed next time when we look at some of the more important houses of the 1920s. Thank you.
Lecture. So the second lecture tonight? This is a different one.
Yeah, the second Geoffrey Baker will be tonight. I mean, I'm sorry, on Wednesday. The lecture is tonight.
Very difficult development matters that come up with the the agency. So he's also taken on another role, which you may have heard of. He's an announced candidate for the city attorney's position in the city of Los Angeles, and wherein I think he'd make a great city attorney, we certainly don't want to lose him in his present role. Murray?
I needed a good introduction since I'm the last speaker on the last panel before lunch. I want to talk about emerging trends in the relationship between cities and redevelopment agencies and the state government and the county government. And the emerging trend that I want to speak about most is the fact that we are killing the goose that laid the golden egg. The emerging trend that I want to talk about is the fact that when the legislature reconvenes again in less than a month, cities will again, and the redevelopment process, will again be under siege to new proposed legislation, to add a new state bureaucracy to oversee cities and redevelopment agencies, to give counties veto power over new redevelopment projects. The tool that was largely instrumental for producing the Olympic skyline that we were all so proud of during the summer is, as I say, under siege. And the main reason it is, in my opinion, is that we are killing the goose that laid the golden egg. That many cities, many consultants, many people active in the field are failing to make a fundamental distinction between appropriate redevelopment projects and inappropriate redevelopment projects. And I should define my terms. I was going to define them as those adopt the appropriate ones, those adopted by my clients.
Before we open it up, I'd like to just comment, sharpen up a couple of things that were suggested by the previous panelists. A few years ago, Hal Jensen, who was then the president of the Urban Land Institute, which is probably the most sophisticated professional development organization in the United States, came up with a little a list of the kinds of things that developers look for from a community trying to undertake development. And some of these, I think, could you identify yourself?
I'm Bill Hoy, and I'm asking this question as a member of the City of Fullerton's Chamber of Commerce Downtown Redevelopment Committee. In Fullerton, we had some 100-year-old redwood infrastructure under our streets, and we used tax increment financing and downtown redevelopment to replace that a couple of years ago. Were we killing the goose that lays the golden eggs?
I think, yeah. I can answer that clearly because I have no knowledge of the facts. Let me just, let me answer it this way. If downtown Fullerton was doing quite well, if the plan for the development of downtown Fullerton that the community wanted was proceeding, and private enterprise was putting that together, and there was no assistance from the public sector needed to carry that out.
Represent some of the TRWR, represent some of the technology we heard about earlier. One of the things that occurs to me is listening to you talk about the adversarial role between developers and local bureaucracy is the information flow that's now has the potential to try to maybe at least clarify some of the information that seems to be a part of a black box for both parties, depending on which view you're looking from. Will the information flow between the adversaries that is promised by the new geographic information system type of technology, will it help or hinder the process? And could you comment on the cost and the risk involved in this adversary? It seems to me that a lot of projects in recent years are, one of their big costs is the risk you have to assess that it'll never get there because the local system will reject it in the late phases of planning. It costs a lot of money. So I presume you have to budget for that cost. Will this information system technology help that process or not? And if not, if you don't see that, could you comment on how it might?
I would like to take that.
I think this is directly to you, Well, I would think that it would be helpful.
I don't know if I can quite verbalize this, but trying to marry the two tracks of the discussion today, I think the information technology is changing the very ground on which we're walking. And I'd like to give you a couple of examples to sort of focus in to a question statement that might get some response from the panel or from somebody in the audience or whatever. But I think, for example, the other day I heard one of the section directors of the Caltrans say that in order to alleviate some of the problems on the freeways in a minuscule way, we need a 13-cent increase in the gas tax. This was in the context of mass transit in LA County. I'm just wondering, and I heard one of the panelists, Mr. Thomas, I guess, talk about how much he likes cities and so forth. We all do, a la Jane Jacobs, but I think information technology is going to be imposing short and long-term centrifugal forces on how cities get built. A major thrust of redevelopment, touch all the bases, has been to create office spaces. As we heard earlier from Mr. Mitchell, and some of the implications of what he was talking about, that you can be out in the middle of nowhere and tap into the world. So perhaps that's why we're having such a glut of office space, for example, in Houston. But then, how about this transportation issue? I see information as being movement. For example, I brought my brain and my eyes and ears up here today on the freeway. Well, I could have done that sitting at home, perhaps. And this goes to maybe the lady panelist here, too, as the chairman of the California Transportation Commission. Are we going to just be extrapolating the traffic flows on the freeways, or are our freeways going to have an impact on them in terms of this very kind of thing that's going on now, information transfer? We don't need to carry our brains to places like these in the near future or even now. Is anybody here thinking about this kind of problem and what these issues are? And added on to that, the whole ideological change in what's going on in terms of our recent election is the entrepreneurial, the enterprise, away from the corporate, if you will. I'm trying to verbalize something, and whoever can pull out something out of that, I appreciate it.